We'll give it like until like 7:03 and then get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started, just so we can keep on time and people can keep trickling in. Welcome everyone to our another iteration of our PSTP webinar series for the year. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Carrie Jansen. I'm the APSA outgoing treasurer and M4 at Emory University of Atlanta's MSTP. I'm really excited to be here tonight with all of my other fellow M4s who have matched and are headed on to exciting places. And so tonight will be fairly informal. We'll just do an open Q&A about the application process and research and residency in general. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and panelists feel free to answer questions in text in the chat box as well. And also feel free to like chime in or don't chime in. Not everyone has to answer every question as the questions come up. So let's start off by introducing ourselves, maybe say who you are, where you're training currently or where you did train, and where you're headed next year and in what specialty. So again, I'm Carrie Jansen. I'm an M4 at Emory University's MSTP in Atlanta, and I'm heading to Yale for their internal medicine physician scientist training program next year. We'll just pass it around. So Jose, you can go next.
Sure, yeah, I'm Jose. I do a PhD from Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine, and I'm headed to CHONY, or Children's Hospital of New York, which is like part of the New York Presbyterian system, in their pediatric scientist training development program. Yeah, and that's pediatrics, obviously. So, yeah.
And then we'll just like popcorn it around if you don't mind.
Yeah, Deb.
Hey everybody, I'm Deborah, and I'm finishing up the MSTP program at Stony Brook in New York, and I'm headed into anesthesiology at WashU in their PSTP program. So thanks for having me. Frank, why don't you go next?
Yeah, sure. Hey everyone, I'm Frank. I'm here at the MSTP program at Emory with Carrie, and I matched at Northwestern for urology. And I will go with, is it Ayaka?
Yep. My name is Ayaka. I am currently at Vanderbilt in the Vanderbilt MSTP, and I matched at Vanderbilt for clinical pathology, so I'll be staying here.
I guess I'm up. I'm Danny. I'm currently an MD PhD student at UNC in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I'm matched at Duke for psychiatry in their physician scientist training program also.
Awesome. Congratulations, everyone, on really exciting matches. It's an exciting time of year. I think maybe we'll start off while we're waiting for the questions to come in. And a question that I got asked by several trainees recently, I'll ask to you, Frank. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to be a surgical scientist and what your application process was like? Navigating the balance of maybe a less defined research track pathway, and still, maintaining your research interests.
Yeah, definitely. I actually came into med school with urology in mind. My dad's actually a clinical urologist. And so coming through like M1, M2, I was looking at different avenues of subspecialties. So there's stone disease, there's infertility andrology, and there's a lot of medicine in urology, which I like, and it affords a lot of research opportunities. And so I'm more on the epidemiology, environmental health track. And so that's what my PhD was at Rollins here at Emory. And going into urology, I'm more focused with precision health, so looking at environmental exposures and how those are related to different urologic outcomes. And that's something that I think will be easier for me to continue on with as a surgeon scientist, just because a lot of the data that I work with is either publicly available or it's clinical trials. And so it's kind of research that's kind of been started that I come in and I do a lot of biostats and epidemiological investigations that way, leaving me time to focus on like surgical procedures and things like that. Northwestern, one of the reasons I chose it, it does have a dedicated, fully funded research year. And one of my options I've been talking to my chair about is doing a postdoc during that year up in Chicago. And that was giving me some more expertise in something that is very specific for what I want to do. A lot of machine learning algorithms now are coming into the fray, and that's what I'm looking at for a postdoc. Yeah.
That's awesome. Maybe dovetailing off of that, if anyone else feels like they were applying in a specialty where there's kind of less defined research tracks, can you comment on how your conversations went and what mechanisms different programs presented to you for still supporting your kind of like time to develop your own independent research program?
Yeah, so anesthesiology, I would definitely say falls into that bin of being like a younger field to get in on the PSTP game. I will say there are about a dozen like formal PSTPs with a proper T32 mechanism in place, WashU being one of them. And then there's another additional 10 plus or so programs that have sort of research tracks that, carve out truly protected research time. I would say it's really important to do your homework about, which of those types of programs you're interested in. And I think that goes for anyone that's, wants a research heavy career and is not going to pursue necessarily a true PSTP program, because there's a lot of great ways to fold in research throughout residency, no matter what you go into. And then I think the other aspect of things is because we are obviously an OR heavy field, of course, we do anesthesiology outside of the OR as well, but we are an OR heavy field, sort of determining, what is your research going to look like? How are you going to balance that? To what degree can you sort of collect data if you're leaning more clinical during your OR times? And what sort of mechanisms does the institution have to support getting in on trials that are already up and going? I will go ahead and like drop the link to my specific program if you want to see how like one example of how research time is protected like later on in the years as being like the traditional 80-20 split, but by no means is that everywhere.
Great. So a common question I think is, how did you decide whether or not to apply for a PSTP? And for those who are in specialties where fellowship after residency is common, how do you already know what kind of subspecialty you want to be in?
I'll go ahead for this one. So I actually didn't really know much about how the application process would go until I was actually doing it. And even then, there was a lot of surprises. A lot of the schools that I was applying to did not have like a PSTP as a direct like application that's separate from the regular pathology application. It was only after I submitted it that they were like, we screen all of our applicants for ones that might, be interested in the PSTP. And so if you want to, you could come to this extra day of interviews or giving a talk or whatever it was. And so it wasn't something that I applied to upfront for a lot of the programs. Um, I talked to my friend who was more sure that he was going to do the PSTP route, and he said that he had emailed the program directors to let them know he's interested if he knew that the program had an established PSTP, but did not offer like that as an application route from the outset.
Yeah, I guess I can answer also quickly. For medicine, the PSTP really gives you like a lot more protected research time than doing categorical. And so knowing that I wanted to have, a strong component of research to my career, and doing like wet lab stuff, it was really important to me to have that protected time and the kind of like structure and support of a PSTP.
Yeah, same as Carrie. And I think for in PEDS, most of the programs will have options to apply like in ERAS. So there'll be like multiple tracks, and there's a couple of different tracks that are pretty common at large academic pediatric places, like the research track, advocacy, or sort of like urban health sometimes, global health tracks. So those are all sort of like options that you can select that you're interested in within ERAS. And so I applied sort of categorical and research track at a lot of different places. I also think like having a research background and sort of like designating that interest was really helpful at some of the more competitive places as well. So in terms of being filtered through for categorical versus a research track, having that research experience is really helpful in terms of being attractive for the folks who are recruiting you for that program. So.
And I will say, just for medicine, you don't have to know what fellowship you want to do ahead of time. You can actually do the PSTP and short track and be a general internal medicine person. It's helpful if you have kind of a direction, but you don't have to necessarily. And they just may not be able to guarantee you a fellowship spot if you're in a program that does that. But there's also programs that don't guarantee fellowship spots, in which case it's obviously totally fine for you to have less idea of what you want to do afterwards. So you can go either way, or you can be a generalist or a hospitalist, and still short track and do a PSTP style thing in medicine. This is a good question. Maybe we can answer it for across specialties. What things should I have in mind as an M3 versus what things should I start thinking about as an M4 as I plan to apply to PSTP or research heavy residencies?
I can chime into this one. I think this one is really specialty dependent. So that's going to depend on whether you're going to more of a surgical subspecialty versus like internal versus something like psychiatry or peds. For psychiatry, at least, I wouldn't really start prepping too much until you're an M4, but I had friends who did PSTPs in surgical subspecialties where like OAs were more important, and like some of the things that are important to like applying to that subspecialty, regardless of PSTP or categorical, you have to start thinking about as an M3. And then there are other ones where like getting specific research experiences during M4 were important. So I had friends who did like RADONC or things like that, where they really tried to do research during M4 with specific people at specific institutions or tried to network in specific ways. So maybe the other panelists can speak more to that. But with psychiatry, at least, I wouldn't say there's much you need to be doing ahead of time outside of just making sure your application is strong in general.
I do want to jump on there and sort of piggyback and say that there was a prior point made about like knowing what fellowship you want to go into. And I think for anesthesiology, that is particularly important. Like some institutions may be stronger in some fellowship areas than others. And oftentimes, fellowship choice sort of plays into the type of research you're interested in doing. I know that that's kind of daunting, like as an MS3 to be like, well, choose a fellowship right now, but it is really, really good if you can to start thinking about those things and getting exposure because, for example, OB anesthesiology is completely different than general anesthesiology, and I'm sure that's true across disciplines as well.
Yeah, I'll just second that in peds. And none of the, or at least none of the PSTPs that I interviewed in guarantee fellowship. It's more of like if you do well clinically, then you, of course, we'll keep you. Was kind of the wording. But it was really helpful to have an idea of my fellowship interests. And most of the PSTP interviews included the fellowship director in their interview. And so having at least some idea of your fellowship interests is helpful for even them when they're sort of interviewing you, especially if you're interested in things that might be slightly more competitive in pediatrics, like peds cards and hemonc.
Yeah, that's great. I think generally just like do well and kind of, M3 or be an M3, don't worry too much about research, like do well clinically and keep up with that kind of stuff is the best you can do.
Yeah, one question I had when I was trying to plan my third and fourth year is there was a lot of this is again going to be very specialty specific, but concern over how much more clinical research I need versus like basic science research. Like, should I carve time away from, working on my basic science research to try to find a case report that I can write? And generally, the advice I was given was to not really worry about that, at least in pathology. Like if you're doing good basic science research, you don't have to like go find the exact uh, area that you're going to be in just to do a smaller project or anything. And I was never asked about any of that in any of my interviews. Um, just since your interest for the specialty was important, at least for pathology, and in terms of that, just stacking all of relevant experiences that, at our institution, we can rotate through pretty much right before my interviews and before ERAS like opened, so that everything was super fresh. I had so much to talk about on interviews, and any parallels you can draw that are hypothetical or real in terms of what kind of research you may want to do in the future, you could talk about. But at least for pathology, we didn't need like specific field specific research.
That's great. Another sort of general question, what do you guys feel like makes a strong or competitive applicant for a research-oriented residency or PSTP? And this may be specialty dependent, and obviously none of us are on the other side of picking people, but I think, you can get a sense as an applicant of what makes people stand out. So, what do you feel like were the most important parts of your application maybe in helping you be a competitive candidate?
I can kind of start. So I think there's two aspects here. There's what makes a strong application and there's what makes a strong interview. And I think in terms of the application, there are some check boxes, I think, on paper that are hard to deny, right? Like they're going to be looking for a number of publications, depending on specialty. Like they're going to be looking for first authorship. They're going to be looking for, are you passionate about research? Does that do you have a valid reason for wanting to continue research in residency? Does that show in your personal statement, or does it show in how you answer certain questions, or what you identified as like the most important experiences in ERAS? Like I imagine things like that are some level of checkbox for the actual specialty, in addition to the checkboxes that get you the interview, right? So test scores, like your dean's letter, your recommendation letters, like those things still matter. Like even if you're doing PSTP or categorical, the things that make you a strong categorical applicant still matter to the PSTPs. Now, I think when it comes to the interview, if you get the actual interview invite, then they're really looking more for fit. So do they think you're actually going to come to their program? Are there people at that institution that you can work with? And do you know that? And do you seem passionate about that, right? Have you already reached out to those people? Or when you meet with the program directors, can you say, hey, like after talking with so-and-so today, I really think I can get off the ground running with their research if I were to come to your program. So that sort of fit thing is really important, I think, when you get to the interview stage. But the on-paper stage, a lot of that's just similar things to the categorical applicants in addition to having the rigorous research.
Going off of that also, when I got invitations for the PSTP interviews, they asked, who I was interested in talking to. And I think that goes on to, showing, have you thought about it? Who would actually be like someone that could be your mentor, when, if you were to be admitted there. And they would try to tailor the interview day to include some of those people so and some of them, at least for Path, also had a research talk.
Mhm. For those in specialties where doing away rotations is more common, did you feel like your requirement or suggestion to do aways was similar to your peers that were applying to categorical programs, or did the research track thing affect anything? For me in medicine, not that many people do aways, I don't think, and definitely not required for PSTPs for sure.
I can start, I guess. Yeah, that's a growing area for anesthesiology. Historically, aways haven't been required, but I definitely think that it's increasing in popularity. And I did a good handful myself. I actually did 3 away rotations during 4th year. I don't think that it necessarily interacts too much with the research side of things, but that being said, of course, if you're moving your entire life for an entire month to a new state and a new campus, of course, while you're there, you should optimize that opportunity as much as possible and reach out to folks and try to set up meetings. You really have nothing to lose by trying to put your best foot forward there.
I think Frank did a couple of ways too, similar to kind of categorical. Yeah.
Yeah, so for urology, aways are really important because it's such a small field. So for me, and this kind of, I think answers or hopefully answers the K word question. When I was doing the aways, I think it was important more to demonstrate the clinical surgical interest, but on those aways, I'd also identified research mentors I'd want to work with. And they took note of that and actually kind of like started the talks of like, we have faculty who have been successful in our residency program, urology, who successfully got K awards and then went on to R1s. Northwestern was one of those programs that was one of the reasons I rank them so high, and then same thing with Stanford as well. So I think the away rotation is important for not only the FaceTime and getting a good letter, but then also it's a way to start to show how much engagement you have, like Danny was saying, in terms of identifying mentors and then going kind of the next steps and following through on that. Yeah.
I would also add it's really helpful to sort of use that as a chance to talk to people that have already been through the program that you're applying to, either on the categorical side or on the research track side. There's not that many people that, complete a PSTP at the end of the day. And it's really important to hear their experiences and did they feel supported and did they make any career pivots either before or during their training there and how was that handled?
What factors influence for you guys what programs you ranked, what kind of programs you ranked? If you interviewed with both categorical and research track programs, how did you decide how to kind of intermix or not those on your rank list?
For me, it was where can I do what I want to do? Not necessarily do they have a really official, strong, big PSDP program. Um, Saying that Vanderbilt doesn't really have a record of a PSTP program, but I had talked to the program director of what I wanted to do, and he included the department chair in my interview so that I could talk to her to arrange what would work for me. And to me, that was more important with given, my family and everything else than to maybe be in like a big, more established PST program that had already a booklet of how this was going to go. Obviously, there's a lot of flexibility in a lot of these programs, but I felt that having been at Vanderbilt for the past decade now, I know a lot of people. I don't need like a certain structure to make things work. So I was more confident in that respect. But some programs be will have like some outline for like you get 2 to 3 years of protected time with this much clinical, this responsibilities, this much research responsibilities. So if that feels like something that fits you and your goals better, I think those are things to also consider. But I wouldn't write off necessarily programs that don't have an official PSTP, um, because you could definitely, I think you could definitely make things work if you want to.
I'll second that 100%. I applied to both categorical and PSTP programs. I also applied to academic and not like more community-based programs, just to get a sense. And similarly, like I have a young child, we didn't really want to leave the state of North Carolina. And so geography actually played a big role into my rank list. I think a lot of my peers, both MD, PhD, and straight MD, geography plays a big role when you get to this point. And so in order to stay close to home, that dictated my rank list. More probably so than other things about the program. And then a lot of these programs, because they have both PSTP and categorical, if being at a certain institution or program or space is more important to you, you can rank both NRMP numbers back to back. So like I ranked both categorical and PSTP for Duke and for UNC because we wanted to stay in the triangle. And so geography kind of dictated that more, and I ranked both numbers higher than maybe some other PSTP programs. And then a lot of quality of life things too. When you've been in an MD PhD program for almost a decade and you get to this age, like things like, cost of living, not having to move, but also like, what does the call schedule look like? What does parental leave look like? Like some of these other things that you just learn along the interview trail, you want to make sure that you're going to be somewhere that you're going to be happy, especially if you're committing to a PSTP that might be an extra year longer, 2 years longer than what the normal general categorical track is, because you're going to be there a little bit longer. But things like fellowship opportunities, I mean, I looked at benefits, I looked at insurance, like all sorts of things. So there's a lot that's going to go into it based on your own personal situation too.
Yeah, for sure. Echo that. I like preference places that were fellowship guaranteed, because I also have a young child and didn't want to move in twice in short order. And then beyond that, the biggest thing was like a research fit. It's kind of interesting, if you're really focusing on that part, then sometimes like when you're in interviews, a lot of your peers are asking like a lot of detailed questions about the call schedule and the computers and the EMR, and it's just interesting to see the different priorities that people have, and so it's kind of a game to figure out, which part of the process, especially for like the medicine PSTPs, where you're really planning for like 3 different phases of your training at once, kind of how your priorities shake out. In the end, I did end up sort of intermixing categorical and PSTPs. So Yale was my number 1 choice, and I actually put the Yale categorical program right after that, because once I had decided that it was my favorite place, I was like, well, I might as well like take 2 shots on goal to stay there. And I think, I felt like it was an institution with a lot of support for physician scientists, and that, that going categorical would mean that I had a 3rd year of medicine instead of 2, which would be fine. And I could likely end up doing a lot of the same things with the research support that's there, just institutionally, even outside the PSTP. So I think it varies based on institution and priority and that sort of thing. One question I want to kind of directly ask to Jose is about any kind of nuances about being a DO applicant to research-oriented programs. One question we got submitted ahead of time was whether most PSTPs require step scores or if COMLEX is okay. So maybe you could answer that and comment on any other kind of differences that you may have found being from a DO background rather than an MD background.
Yeah, for sure. I think again, it'll definitely depend on the specialty. So, um, I think if you're applying IM or PEDS, maybe complex is more widely accepted across institutions. But again, I think it's really sort of like maybe talking to your advisors and then looking at the institution. I actually didn't have step scores, so I only applied with Comlex, and I'm also Columbia's first DO in their pediatrics program, which is awesome. But I think it really depends on the institution. And when I interviewed there, the residency director told me that I'd be their first DO, and she mentioned how excited she was about changing the culture at Columbia. So if you're applying to places that are particularly don't have any DOs or very few DOs in their program, I think it's just important to one, not sort of like self-select out, like apply to the places that you're interested in, and then understand that there might be some barriers at particular institutions. So if you're applying, I think having step scores are just going to make you more competitive, just because it's going to be easier for places that might not know how to evaluate the complex, not to have that as a barrier or additional barrier. So I think that's generally the advice that people give widely. But for me, I didn't really need it to match where I wanted to in pediatrics and in a PSTP. So.
For anyone who is applying to a specialty or planning a research career that's a little bit different than what your PhD was in, how did that go in your application process? Like the person that asked this question said, my research is in surgery, but I decided I want to do oncology later. Was that your experience? How did you navigate those conversations? What do you think about that generally? Wow, everybody's sticking in their field. I will say I think generally it's totally fine to kind of pivot. If you're, I think especially going from a like a more kind of maybe competitive or like prior experience influenced field like surgery to medicine is probably easier. But I think this is a common than the inverse. But I think this is a common question even like within medicine. Like I did oncology research in my PhD and now I want to be a cardiologist. Like, is that okay? And I think the answer is like absolutely yes. The programs care to see that you have the research skills to do research, and the content of your actual research is not really that important. If you have known what you wanted to do forever and stay on straight through, that's great, but it's not required by any means. And the biggest thing they're looking for is just like the aptitude and the like interest in doing research, regardless of the context. In a lot of ways, like if you do pivot, having experience in two different fields may help your research in the long term anyways.
I would also just tack on there that, for T32 programs, like that is a training grant. So there is going to be a portion of that where it's like, what skill set do you not have that you want to acquire through that training, right? Because if you're ready to, stay your course, which is great, by all means, like make the jump to the K award, because I can totally envision that being a question, like, why is it that you need this time and this protected time to learn exactly what. So I will say, I wouldn't be at all afraid to say like, oh, I want to make this shift and learn this completely new thing, even if it doesn't keep with your current research.
I think at least in all the science I have done personally, like it's much more important to be able to ask the relevant questions and to figure out a way to test that, you know, in a well-designed way and to then apply that to clinical spaces. That the exact topic that you're going to be asking the question for, I really don't think really matters until unless, like you said, like you've been gung-ho about autism since you were like day one. Personally, all of my prior research and even some of my graduate school rotations were in neuroscience, and then I jumped ship to immunology and have not done any neuroscience since. But no one really questions like, you know, that I'm not very like um loyal to one topic or anything. It's more that I have a passion for research. And if you are switching topics or fields. At least in pathology, I found a couple of things I kind of wondered about when I was rotating through the clinical spaces. And, it's not too relevant to what I've previously done, but I kind of soft pitched them in my personal statement. Like, it'd be really cool to explore some of these topics once I start in pathology. So just showing interest and ability to think. It's hard to quantify that, but I think you can demonstrate it in several different ways, through whether it's your personal statement or through your interviews.
Yeah, and I think for me, my PhD research was actually in hypertension. So I did mouse models for like blood pressure and environmental exposures. And so I'm doing urology. And so on my interviews, they did ask like, oh, what aspects of urology are you interested in? But honestly, like you'll realize a lot of your skills, they don't all need to be transferable, but you learn a lot. And I think the biggest thing, like Ayaka was saying, is like learning how to think. And I think one of our mentors who used to be at Emory, he said like, your PhD ultimately is like in science. Like people expect you to be able to do research, be able to think about the topics. And then to Deborah's point, like you're gonna have like training grants that once you identify what you want to do in that specialty, because you know how to do research, it actually just makes you very attractive. And they like that I was bringing in a very unique aspect of environmental exposure and things into urologic outcomes. And so I think that's going to also make me a little bit more, in their words, more competitive for certain K awards and just like research funding and things like that.
Yeah. The flip side of this question, someone kind of asked, they specifically about kind of like in the cancer world, what type of cancer. And so they asked, like, for me, am I planning to stay in the same kind of cancer I did for my PhD? And why did if yes or no, why is that? And what's my thought process for diversifying and finding mentors to support me? And I think this is applicable for like anyone that's staying in kind of a similar field, or even just kind of how you're thinking about the postdoc time. So for me, I think that I may want to stay in a similar kind of cancer long term, but for my postdoc time, I'm pretty open to like whatever the best mentor is within the kind of general field that I want to be in. And I'm happy to kind of carve out something that is related to my interests and the core of their lab. For me, the priority is the mentorship and training that I'll get in the lab, and I can kind of find my way to the specific topic back that I want to eventually, because eventually you have to spin off your own project from whoever's lab you train in for your postdoc time anyways. So you're unlikely to take like something core to their lab. And so for me, I think I may want to stay like in GU tumors long term, but I'm open to kind of seeing where my training takes me, and think mentorship is really the priority.
And honestly, looking at a lot of like successful PIs, you see that they follow, they're not stuck to something. They're willing to move around. So flexibility is, a good, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Well, it's good to show that you can be flexible and adaptable to different fields too.
Let's see. What did you guys find varied between institutions in terms of like what was offered for research oriented programs? Maybe like what were some common things that were kind of core to the research oriented programs? And then maybe if there were any particular things that stood out from different programs about how different institutions support research oriented trainees. I'll say in medicine, like the protected research time is a requirement of being board eligible if you do the short tracking of 2 years instead of 3 of medicine. So that is like pretty standard across any program where you're going to short track, is you absolutely have to have 3 years of mentored research where you have a small amount of continuity clinic in addition to your research time, or else you can't be board eligible. So that is like very standard. Some institutions have additional financial support during your fellowship years, like above and beyond the PGY scale. Some have financial support for your research directly. Many have like K award, kind of like boot camp type programs to help you write your K award. They have lots of them have T32s that you're on during your fellowship. Some of them have a like sort of soft guarantee of an instructor or early faculty position if you get a K award at the end of the program. But a lot of the details of all of those things vary based on program and institution.
I would say in anesthesia, it's like very similar. For the most part, it does vary as far as like flexibility of your schedule, especially in the later years, like when you're allowed to take the research time, how many electives you're required to do. I would also say, to Carrie's point about pay be above and beyond the PGY scale, that's definitely something to ask about. And then the other thing I wanted to point out earlier is that programs may be more or less transparent about like historic trajectories of their graduates, and that's definitely something that I would ask about, look into. Some of them have them like on their website, like this is everybody that's ever graduated from the program, or are willing to connect you right up front. And some, especially the younger programs, like may not be unless you ask about it directly. So would keep that in mind.
Yeah, I second that. Seeing where graduates go. Do they all stay? Do they all leave? Is it half and half? Do they go into industry? Do they all quit research? I think those are all important questions, or just to look at. Um, and importantly, like, are they doing what you want to do? So if a lot of people are doing what you would be interested in, then you can, somewhat assume that they have good support for people going into that pathway. At least for path, and this again gets at, you might be earlier in your training, and it's a little daunting to think like 3 steps ahead. But this also might be specialty specific, but whether I thought it was pretty common to like move between residency and fellowship, but apparently, at least in pathology, more people move between fellowship and like the next stage than people do between residency and fellowship. And so it's very common to stay for your fellowship. So when you apply for the residency, you want to go to somewhere that has the fellowship you want to go into. And for me, I also wanted I of course I'm pretty much open to anything, which is kind of my MO for my entire training. Um, but if I wanted to know if I were to stay, what was staying and moving on to junior faculty positions, what was that going to look like? And so that was an entire discussion with the department chair also.
Actually, to piggyback off of that point, I do think that the programs vary a little bit as far as how accessible the chair is, and you should definitely take note of who the chair is and what culture they're trying to set for the department. Do they themselves do research, or have they in the past, or are they trying to grow research? And exactly as you said, how do they handle the transition for young faculty? Absolutely.
And
What
if
do
you
you?
get, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
My child is right here. Sorry, he keeps on bopping in and out. But the other thing is, if you do get some interviews with junior faculty, I also asked them how they felt supported. What were their transitions like if that happened at that institution? What due to form, what like concrete examples of support they had? What did they wish they had that they didn't, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. What do you guys think strengthened your application in order to like make it through the first kind of filter and be invited for an interview? And did you do any networking outside of your own home institution to try to like boost your application ahead of the application season?
Yeah, I think for urology being such a small field, one of the main things are recommendation letters. Like they really want to know that people in the field are going to vouch for you. So that's probably equally one of the most important things. The next thing being the research for me really made me stand out. And in terms of going through the application season. So I reached out to people before my aways so I'd have conversations with them about different research options when I got there. So I did one at Cornell, and it's like a very heavy research program for urology, 6-year program, and they love research. So it was great to be able to not only get insights into their program that way, but then also they knew all the programs that were also research heavy. And then in terms of things I did before the application cycle, I actually been working remotely on a research group with the guy, Dr. Eisenberg at Stanford. We met at a conference, and we just been doing weekly, like 10-15 minute Zoom meetings, published a lot of papers together. He wrote me an amazing rec letter. I was strongly considering them as well. So I think networking wise, I did a lot at conferences when I went. If I had questions about the program, I reached out directly to residents, particularly about research questions, and none of them were like, "Oh, I'm too busy to talk." They would take calls. They would give me information over email. So I think networking will help a lot for you to get also perspective on programs, but then for programs to be like, "Oh, he's interested or she's interested in us." Yeah.
I'll second that. I also did a lot of networking post-interview, which I'll come back to. But pre-interview, I think there's maybe only 1 or 2 institutions where I just happened to know like a faculty member who like left my home institution to go there. So I figured, why not reach out to them? But for psychiatry, at least, I didn't do any like other sorts of like networking things ahead of time. I mean, you still want to look up who you're putting on that. Like when they ask, who do you want to meet with during your interview? Be thoughtful about those people. Go read their bios, look at their CV, look at their publications. Like you still want to put in that time and effort to be thoughtful about that. But in terms of the actual like ERAS application, I will second the recommendation letters. Even like the clinical aspects of those recommendation letters, I think your personal statement and your rec letters and how your recommenders speak about you, at least in psychiatry, they just really want you to be a cool person and someone who's like fun to work with and is good to talk with people, and those sorts of things. Like who you are and who your personality is really matters. And so I think that really shines through in ways that aren't just your CV. But I will say I did a lot of post-interview networking just for my own rank list, right? Talking to residents, reaching out to people who have gone through the program, getting a sense of what the program culture is like. And that's a separate sort of networking for the sake of your own decision.
Yeah, for the
Sorry.
for the first pass, getting the interview, definitely, my goodness, definitely the recommendation letter. And I got one from my PI. I know he was very generous in the letter, and my publication record definitely helped. Oh my gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. I'll come back.
I was just going to add that I would not worry about attending conferences for this purpose as a 3rd year. I think 3rd year you really should be focusing on your scores and your it's a lot. But for 4th years, absolutely, I think it really helps. ASA is like the biggest conference for anesthesiology. I would say that go there and maybe don't necessarily try and talk to every program director. Like it can be like a sea of applicants. It's like a little bit insane. But it is really helpful to sort of scout out what research is going on. You can certainly meet research track residents at those types of conferences. You can meet PIs that you might be more or less interested in. I forgot this other point that I wanted to say earlier, but hopefully it'll come back to me. So I'll circle back as well.
Yeah.
And you just reminded me what I had forgotten, which was I didn't really do any specific networking for the purposes of applications, only like what I did through my research because of research things. And I didn't really know specific people or program directors going into it. But at least in pathology, that was not a problem whatsoever. The getting that interview at post interview, like we were talking about, it's more for you to find a match, but be to get the interview, I think the rec letter and what you write about your experiences, and yeah, I think those were the most important. Even the clinical letters, if you showed kind of interest in research topics or something, they can talk about that too. For at least for my rec letters as well, I could just put this in there. Some of I try to be clear about what kind of things I wanted to emphasize in my rec letter. That may be important. Like for pathology, it's important to show that you're actually really interested in pathology and why, like that you're passionate about the subject. And I would kind of give like examples of some experiences that we had shared together with the attending or whatever that what I thought would highlight some of the attributes that I thought I wanted to be highlighted in my application, to kind of make it like a nice whole package.
Yeah, I would echo what everyone said and also plug the AAP ASCI APSA joint meeting that happens every year in April. A big part of that meeting for the APSA attendees is the residency luncheon, where we have this year we had almost 40 residency programs there to meet applicants specifically and try to recruit people to their programs. So that is like a kind of low-hanging fruit way to meet a whole bunch of programs at once in a diversity of specialties. And sometimes, you know, the programs may be like umbrella programs where they're representing physician scientists at their entire institution. And so that's a great way, especially if you are coming up on applying like towards the end of your M3 year, that's a great time to go and try to meet those programs as you're heading into application series. And thanks, Deborah, for putting the joint meeting save the date in there, the end of April next year.
Can I second that? Because like the truth is this is a small community. Like, let me be clear, I interviewed with like the same people at like all of my research days. Like we just got to know each other. Like it's a small community. So like especially like go to the APSA conference, like let the program directors know your name. Like there's something to be said about like they'll know who you are through this application season. Like and that really does matter. Like I think that's something to be said, and I think that's where the networking does come in. And especially like if you're going to go to one conference that's like either like one like specific to the specialty or to APSA generally. I went to APSA last April before interview season also, and really did benefit from the luncheon. Just again for getting that little bit of networking and letting people like program directors just know who you are in your specialty of choice.
Yeah, and they all talk to each other. They all know each other. So you know, be mindful of that. Don't lie and say a program is there first, you know, the general uh recommendations, but know that regardless of what school you end up choosing, if you know you're going to become part of that community in one form or another, you're probably going to be seeing some of those program directors or faculty from other institutions at the specific conferences and things in the future. So if they're not going to be part of your training directly, then they might be future colleagues. So I would treat interactions with schools that you are interested and not interested in, all with that mindset.
On a related note, I would say don't be afraid to connect on the social media platforms as well. You can actually get a pretty darn good sense of resident life off of Instagram in particular. But if you're more of a professional network, then I would obviously say Twitter or X or the Dead Bird app or whatever we're calling it these days. But you can get a lot of detail there.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe a final question, or maybe second to last, depending on how long it takes us. Since there are several of us here who are parents, and then I think this can be a general question too. One that was submitted ahead of time was for students who are parents, how do you handle matching in mid-March and moving your family by June? Did you have a good sense of where you would match prior to match day? I would say probably all of us would say stay tuned for how that goes. At least I guess for Deborah and I who are relocating a significant distance away at least. But yeah, I don't know. Stay tuned. It's a wild ride.
There is a reason I am staying here.
Same. But don't be afraid to like ask for like help with moving fees or things like that. Like at least in psychiatry, people were super open about like, did they have kids? Were they expecting kids? Like, were they currently pregnant? I ran into a couple different people who were pregnant with me along the interview trail. Like people were very open about these conversations, and I made it clear to programs. I was like, this is part of my decision. Like where you're gonna end up on my rank list is gonna be in part like how well is this a good fit for my family. Mm-hmm. So, and there were a couple programs that did, I think, offer like some sort of like moving supplement too.
Yeah, I do think it speaks volumes when chairs or program directors go out of their way to make a point about support networks in and outside of the institution itself. People our age often are moving spouses, children, or other caretaker burdens they might have on their plate. And any nod to that is, a green flag in my book. So keep an eye out for the green flags as well as the red flags.
And then maybe to go ahead, Ayaka.
Sorry, my 2 cents is that you could go to the best program in the world, United States, whatever. But I can tell you that if my child is miserable and my spouse is miserable, I'm not going to reap any benefits of that program. So, knowing your priority, knowing your values, if you don't have like a family to tote around, then your priority list is going to look significantly different than what mine did, and that's totally okay. But being honest to yourself and what your values are and what your priorities are in making and making sure that you're not shy about making sure that you know about those aspects of the programs really. And not just to look good to get into top programs. Because at the end of the day, this is training for you, and you want to make sure you set yourself up for success as well.
Yeah. And then kind of the second part of that question that's more general, not specific to having kids. Did you feel like you had a sense of where you might end up on match day ahead of time, or were you kind of like truly waiting for the envelope? I'll say in medicine, there's like a growing interest in kind of decreasing post-interview communication. So many institutions have signed this like letter that says that they're not going to try to influence your decision. They're not going to like tell you where you stand, that sort of thing. I do think that it's like slightly more common amongst PSTPs to have like a rank to match type of like email come out, but it's still probably the minority of programs that do that. And so you never really, I think in medicine, you never really know unless you ranked number one, one of the places that does do rank to match, and they told you that. But I think that's the minority of people that really truly know ahead of time in medicine, at least.
Yeah, I'll say I was very surprised by the number of programs that were like subtly telling me things when like they were very clear, like, we're not going to tell you anything after your interview. Like, this is our stance, no post-interview communication. But here's this email like a day before your rank list is due telling you that we very strongly liked you. So there were some programs that were very subtle about it, and you had to kind of read between the lines. And then I did have a few that straight up told me whether I was ranked to match, which caught me off guard. So I didn't know they were allowed to do that. So there is some, like, especially among PSTPs and it being a smaller world, there is some wiggle room there, especially like when you may have like asked for specific things or had specific things about like your training that programs may be looking to either accommodate or like help with.
I think also the second looks are an opportunity to have those conversations about like I really am trying to like move my entire life here and what is the standing, so to speak.
And to note that it's not against the rules for them to tell you where you stand. It's just against the rules for them to try to like influence your decision kind of in return. So that maybe helps people sometimes clarify like what programs might say to them. And if they do try to influence you, then that is a match violation.
Yeah, like they can tell you if like you're like where you stand on their rank list, but they cannot ask you anything about like your decision or your list or anything. They can just inform you and that's it. That has to be end of conversation.
And even for the places that sign that like post-interview communication thing, you can always reach out and ask them questions. That's just a statement of them saying we are not going to like pressure you or reach out or tell you where you are on our list, but they will always answer your questions if you have more questions after the interview day.
Pathology is great. You'll pretty much know a couple months in advance. They don't say it, but they say it. And I kind of pretty much knew. I thought, if something went terribly wrong, I might end up somewhere else, but I kind of knew people who graduated before me, I think they both knew in about January, around January also.
Anecdotally, I know someone who did path and like researchy path, and they like literally bought a house in the city they moved to before match day because they were so sure about where they were going. So seems to be a little bit different in some different specialties.
And how risk averse you are.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to make sure to respect everyone's time. I know for myself personally, I'll put my contact info in the chat. I'm happy to help anyone one-on-one. But thank you so much to all of our panelists, and congratulations again, everyone, on a really fantastic match. Looking forward to seeing where all of you and like where you are and how you do, where you're going, and all the things you achieve. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Say bye.